So this video lecture is going to talk about Robert Browning's My Last Duchess and Christina Rossetti's In an Artist's Studio, the two poems that we're reading for the Gender and Sexuality's reading list for the Victorian era. So to start with Browning, Browning is sort of an odd duck in terms of poetry because of the way his career trajectory went. So early in his career, he was actually better known as the husband of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was much more famous as a poet. But then, after she died, during the 1860s and 1870s, through the end of his life, Robert Browning developed his own following of people who thought that he was a poetic genius. And one thing that Browning really did that contributed majorly to the course of Victorian poetry was he developed the dramatic monologue. And he developed it into an art form in a way that few other people did. I mean, Tennyson uses the dramatic monologue really skillfully, but Browning has a better flair for the dramatic as opposed to the monologue. And we see this in My Last Duchess, and we can contrast this with Tennyson's Ulysses, because in Ulysses, it's just the title character, so speaking. But he's not speaking to anyone in particular. He's musing, I suppose. Whereas in My Last Duchess, the speaker, Duke Alonso II, Duke of Ferrara, in Italy during the Renaissance, is speaking to the agent of another nobleman whose daughter he proposes to marry after the death of his first wife. So we have a dramatic component here because this is set up like dialogue, even though there's only one speaker. So Ferrara is speaking to someone, whereas Ulysses is not speaking to anyone. The other thing I want to say about dramatic monologue is that it's written in iambic pentameter, and I've marked this out here. Hopefully you can see this okay. I've marked this out in the first couple of lines where the sort of U shape almost represents an unstressed syllable, and the dash accent / thingy represents a stressed syllable. So iambic pentameter, which is the standard metric form of blank verse, which is what most dramatic monologues are written in, iambic pentameter is the standard metrical, standard meter of this form. So, but let's talk about the content of My Last Duchess fairly quickly. Basically what's happening here is Ferrara is showing this nobleman's agent a portrait of his previous wife, a portrait of his last duchess. And what he says, we start to get into the middle of the poem through the last quarter or so. What he's talking about is how his wife would smile at everyone and sort of appreciate everyone and thank everyone for anything they did for her. Ferrara's resentment builds up over this. He says here, this is lines 32 through 34, he says of his wife and her sort of thanking everyone, as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. So there's this sort of resentment that Ferrara is not sort of singled out for special favor by his wife, that everyone makes her happy, everyone sort of brings out her joy, her joie de vivre, as it were. And ultimately we get this note, 45 and 46, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. So we have this oppressive man, this oppressive Duke, Ferrara, sort of making his ploy to marry the daughter of this other nobleman by telling the story of his last duchess, who he killed her joy, basically, killed her sort of enjoyment of life in this very tyrannical way. And what's really interesting about this poem is that throughout the center of the poem, throughout the middle portion, he's talking about how he wants her to have been more discriminatory. He wants her to have valued him more. And then in the last few lines of the poem, 54 through 56, we have a shift. We have this total shift. He says, "Notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me." So we have this moment at the end of the poem where he's been criticizing his Last Duchess for not devoting herself more to him, where he moves from her portrait to another artwork in his collection as though they're just sort of on totally equal footing. So he actually reproduces this sort of non-discriminatory appreciation, this non-discriminatory enjoyment that he so critiqued in her. But let's move on to Christina Rossetti's In an Artist's Studio. So Rossetti was the daughter of an Italian immigrant. She was what we call high church. So the Church of England, which is the official state religion of Britain, was divided at this time between three different branches. The high church, to which Christina Rossetti and her family belonged, was the most like Catholicism. So it was very much concerned with ritual, and it was concerned with ceremony and things like this as a sacraments as a means of salvation and things like this. And this actually influences a lot of Rossetti's poetry, not necessarily in an artist's studio, though. What we're getting in an artist's studio, this is actually also really a painting-centered poem like My Last Duchess. But Rossetti is critiquing the pre-Raphaelites, which was a school of painters basically founded by her brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And the pre-Raphaelites were famous for sort of idealized depictions of women, and I'll actually show you guys this. I tell you in the lecture notes to go look at these two paintings, but you get here two paintings by Dante Gabriel Rossetti in the color inset on page C6. So you get Soul's Beauty right there and Body's Beauty right there. So you can check those out, and you can get a sense of what pre-Raphaelite painting was like. So in this poem, Christina Rossetti is critical of the way that the pre-Raphaelites represented women as idealized, non-distinct, and one of the big issues for her is that the woman herself gets obscured by the man's vision of her, by the man's sort of idealized version of her. And we get this hinted at in line 3. We found her hidden just behind those screens. So this line is suggesting to us that the painting of this model is actually hiding or obscuring the woman herself. And we get this more definitely in the last line, line 14, where Rossetti says of this painting, "Not as she is, but as she fills his dream." So this is, again, this critique of the way that women are represented by the pre-Raphaelites as their own idealized version of women rather than the women themselves. And to make this critique, Rossetti uses what's called a Petrarchan sonnet. Now, a sonnet, hopefully you all remember because I think I've mentioned this already. A sonnet is a 14-line poem, and the reason it's actually quite a clever decision to use the sonnet form is because a sonnet itself is traditionally a love song. And so here she's being critical of the way that women are represented in art. So sonnet, 14 lines. A Petrarchan sonnet is divided between an octave, which is the first 8 lines, and a sestet, which is the last 6 lines. There's a couple of different rhyme schemes a Petrarchan sonnet can use. The octave will always be the same in a Petrarchan sonnet, A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A rhyme scheme. The sestet, there's 3 or 4 different versions. The one that this particular poem uses is C-D, C-D, C-D. So overall we have an A-B-B-A, A-B-B-A, C-D, C-D, C-D rhyme scheme here. And this is also in iambic pentameter, so again, 5 metric feet per line in an stressed pattern. So this is, the way that these poets sort of use art and use painting as a basis for exploring representations of women is really quite important and really quite interesting, because paintings have almost always been of women. So I mean, this is not sort of exclusive, but women have long been idealized in painting, and actually if you sort of flip through the color insets here, you can see this. I mean, you've got Ophelia, which is not a pre-Raphaelite painting, but it shares certain characteristics. We've got the awakening consciousness, which actually connects back to prostitution, because this is supposed to be a prostitute sort of realizing her moral failing. We've got some paintings and photography here drawn from Arthurian legends. And so all of these things, I mean, we get all of these depictions of women in art, and art helps shape our understanding of the world. Art helps shape our consciousness. And so when Browning and Rossetti pick up on this and start to interrogate it in poetry, we start to ask new and different questions about how women are represented in art. And look, we've got Dante Gabriel Rossetti's painting on the front here. So I mean, when poets and when other artists start to pick up on these trends and ask questions about representations of women, it takes us in new directions. We start to think critically in new ways about representations of gender.